So, hello and welcome back, everybody, from around the world to the IT Leader Growth Summit. In this session, we are going to discuss the topic, driving culture change to support execution of your digitization strategy. And we are with this sharing 3 data-based case studies. I've got with me Tim Dixon. Tim is Equinix's Chief Vision Officer, and his career, however, started with an M.Ed, and he started his career at Brock University as director for a fee-for-service research center, disseminating empirical research while leveraging organizational use of experiential learning. You can hear it's already a mouthful what Tim gave me there, and he is very much a data person, so you will see that as we go on. He then served as Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce's Leadership Center Senior Consultant. There he was designing and facilitating workshops and complex shareholder engagement processes. And much later at the same venue, now a privately owned conference center, he served for years as meeting experience architect for strategy and innovation services, following 15 years leading his organizational development consultancy in Courage. So as you can hear, Tim is very versed in data and in research. And with that, I'll hand over to Tim to tell us a bit more what he wants to share with us today.
Thanks, Matthias. When you reviewed my my bio or my resume that way, I sound like I'm 50 years old. Well, actually, I'm 52, but it sounds like I've been working for 100 years in the field. So the work that I've been doing is related to culture change, leadership development, organizational strategy, innovation, that kind of work. And as I said, really starting back in the late 80s, I started to do a lot of work around researching basically the impact of experiential learning as a training and development tool or lever. And so I'm going to share some examples, not going back that far, but I'll go back as far as, say, 10 years ago to make reference to a culture change initiative. I'll also share some of the more recent work I've been doing in the last 5 years with a robotics company. And then finally, the third case study will be a bit of an overview of some of the work I'm doing right now for an educational sector, not-for-profit. And all of these imply massive transformation, which of course has a lot to do with IT initiatives. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm going. And most recently on screen right now, you can see I was in the lovely city of Toronto, and that's a beautiful backdrop, and I was working the room in there. So I'll tell you a little bit about that story, and that was Pathways to Education, which is my last case study I'll share, Matthias. All right, so I'm going to jump into this story is a case example of the cliche or the very wise words of culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. So as an IT leader, we definitely need to be able to leverage disruptive technologies, but we also need to keep our eye on the impact that may be having, or the obstacles we might need to overcome to be a successful implementer of change when we talk about culture. So that's really where I'm going with this. And this specifically case study is an example of an acquisition. There was a small family-owned business that was a grocery distributor in Western Canada. And they had a 70, 80-year history of being quite successful as the largest grocery distributor, family-owned business. And they got acquired by an organization called GFS, or Gordon Food Services, which is a bit more of a US-based global presence. And that had a lot of change coming their way. Specifically, we were using an organizational culture survey known as Dennison Organizational Culture Survey. My buddy Dan Dennison had developed this tool again in the 80s, and it's got very excellent benchmark baseline to measure your organization against other best of class organizations. So it is not just a bunch of psychological constructs around culture. It's based on business performance. So we were using that tool, the DOCS, Dennison Organizational Culture Survey, to track culture change over several years. And eventually in this case study, I'll share you an example where they were when we started the work and where they ended up just within 3 years. Again, this was probably about an 8 or 9 year business relationship. And we were doing so that they could track the culture impact around business growth. That was their goals they had. So I'm not going to explain in too much detail about the Denison Culture Survey, but there's 4 major sections, if you could describe it that way. One is measuring adaptability. And when we're measuring adaptability, we're really looking at, are we listening to the marketplace? So there's some, in that corner of the pie, if you will, there's 3 indices like creating change, customer focus, and organizational learning. Those are little wedges. And I'm going to show you more detail in the next slide, but that's basically the tool looking at adaptability. Down there in the bottom left is involvement. And that really is, are we engaged? Are people, are they aligned? Are we connecting the dots between them as contributors to our business mission or mandate? You know, why do we exist? What's our direction, purpose? Where are we going? And so that mission tends to be top down. It tends to come out of the C-suite or the leadership team and then cascades that down to the shop floor. Whereas involvement, we're really looking at the shop floor and how they help lift us up in our initiatives, be those technological or culture change. And so we'll call those kind of a tension between top down and bottom up. And that's a really fun part of using this tool. It's not either or, it's both and. We need both clarity around where we're headed, but we also need a shop floor buy-in to where we're going. And the same with adaptability. At that corner of the model, the Denison, the opposite, if we would want to call it adaptable and, you know, changing on the dime as the customer's needs evolve, consistency. How do we stick with what we're good at and make sure that we've got agreement and some coordination, integration between our different functions? And again, that's where IT leaders can really help move the meter stick forward around where are we going to tighten up some of the opportunities to grow by scaling or implementing some digitization processes. So that's the basic structure of the model. And here's, again, a bit of a blowout, more detail if we wanted to get into the indices. Like in involvement, we've got team orientation or capability development. And that's kind of the stuff that they were really looking at us in the beginning. And then we found our way into this, again, this culture assessment to drive towards their business goals. And what we see in the bottom left is an example of where more color's better. Basically, if we were looking at goals and objectives, you don't want to be in the first quartile. The 1 to 25% of the organization that fill this out would be lowest performers in that domain. So again, it's a self-assessment, not around the individual person, but as we complete this as an online tool or a paper-based tool back in the olden days, we're really asking people to look at their organization, not themselves. It's the organization's culture, specifically in this case, goals and objectives, the degree to which they feel, those respondent to the Denison Organizational Culture Survey, the degree to which they feel there's clarity and it's right there for them every day. So if we're in the 4th quartile, meaning the 76th to near 100% of top performers, we'd have more red in our chart. Make sense? Okay.
Absolutely. I think that gives it a good overview.
So here's an example of where this is not generic. This is literally, I'm speaking 8 years back. Their goals from 2007 to 2010 was to really move in 3 strategic directions: profitability, business stability, and people development. And again, we're an OD consultancy back in the good old days. They brought us in to pull the lever around leadership and culture, but we absolutely facilitated the strategic planning process and drove innovation initiatives so that we come up with what kinds of technological tools will drive them towards increased profitability, sustainability, and culture change, people stuff. And so they came into things like profitability model. Right prior to us working with them, they did not have anything called pay for performance. Now that takes some metrics to measure how's each individual contributor out there in a warehouse setting, loading trucks and moving food in and out of the facilities. How do they get paid for what they pack and pick and pack, as I believe what they called it. And how do we track what each individual is doing so that they're contributing to the profitability and again, get compensated, get a slice of the profits. And so that's an example of one IT initiative that was very disruptive, eventually for good, but at first a little stressful. It wasn't all working at first. So that was an example, and I won't go through all of them around order size or.
Yeah, I think we need to just give one example, because otherwise we'll not go through this. And I think it's more the model than the exact example that is found.
Thanks, Matthias. So here's where we started to do the culture assessment in 2007. This is a snapshot with 54 respondents, and that was people leaders, so frontline managers, supervisors, right up to the executive team, which wasn't a massive company. Again, we're talking SMEs, so small, medium enterprises. This, I think, employee headcount might have been around 350 at the time when we started this initiative. I think they might have netted out a few years later under 500 employees. So there's an example where their mission was, at best, it was kind of the 53rd percentile compared to other organizations. And we're talking 1,200 other organizations have done a Denison survey. So this is not a great set of results, but it led to some great conversations and some very specific and detailed action planning around what are we going to change, and again, what I like about the Denison, if you want to increase your adaptivity in a marketplace, you're probably a different kind of company than one that wants to really button down coordination and integration. And these guys wanted to really tighten up some of those behaviors, processes, practices around coordination, integration. They had to get clearer on strategic direction. Look at their capability development, 15% compared to all other organizations, 15 percentile. So they're pretty low performing in those areas. 3 years later, we're quite happy with the results. And again, if all it was just warm fuzzies, well, we got a lot of mission and we've really bumped up our capability development. Really, who cares? How are we performing against the market measures? And they did really nail some of their goals around profitability, stabilization, and culture change. So that would be, again, a success story for us. And that's using that specific tool, the Denison Culture Survey.
Yeah, great. I think if you want to unshare your screen, then we can have about a 5-minute or so discussion about this, because I would like to know a bit more about that. Is if you are now sitting here, I'm an IT leader in a mid-sized organization. I'm looking at this and saying, I know we need to do something. I know there's our culture is not right. How would I approach this? Could I use a tool like that? How would I use it? Or does it need to come from top down?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matthias. Thank you. I think that, top down, when we say top down, I guess there was an executive team, what we call the ELT, Executive Leadership Team. There was also, we'll call it the management tier, like everyone else that has a reporting up to that executive team. And I found that in this scenario, we definitely had sponsorship with a very, I'll say, enlightened president CEO. So that person was standing beside, in partnership, the IT leader, who really didn't have a department, a division. He did not, in this case, Jerry did not have a lot of bench strength to deploy in changing the culture, but he definitely had to see the importance and get alignment with Tim, the president, to integrate the work of human resources for culture change and leadership development, and the work of his department, himself, and maybe some externals he would hire on a kind of an as-need basis, subcontracting them for different parts of the projects. So I see that it was, while it had support from top down, it was absolutely that IT leader's partnership with HR that made it possible. So that was a takeaway for me, Matthias, was to learn pretty quickly around an IT leader may see the need to use some, at that time, again, we're talking back in the, 2010 was when we finished this assessment process. There needed to be a lot of integration between the IT function, HR, the executive team, supporting them on trying some things that didn't necessarily work at first, but not just shutting it down because it didn't work. It was an iterative process, and that was very important for them to have that support from the executive team, the IT guy.
What I like about the model is that it actually tangibly somehow on a graph shows our performance. And I mean, obviously you have got those wedges that you're looking at, but on the other side, probably if you're looking at the initiatives you did, they didn't have exactly a mapping to the wedges. They just had an effect, because that's what you're looking at culture. Is that right? If I'm understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and yes. Good observation. So the wedges didn't line up exactly with initiatives. You know, if you want to have a pay for performance, then you need a lot more green, you know, in the model. Like, it wasn't like that. It's more of a macro around we're changing culture. But what I do like about the Denison, Matthias, is that Dan, when he built it, and I think he was at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when he built it out of the business school, not a psychology program or some other, just, you know, he made these vague concepts up around culture. What he did was look at different organizations that were best of class, whatever sector, pharma, finance, you name it, you know, technology, whatever they were into, advertising. They found those that were outperforming their peers in their particular industry or sector had some common characteristics. And so the impact of having those characteristics included things like ROI, ROA, market share, customer loyalty, employee engagement. So some of the outcomes from driving culture changes can predict that you'll make gains in your market or your role. If you're not for profit, we're not talking market share, but rather some other deliverables to your stakeholders. So what Dan came up with was a tool that measured the results first, and then found out what characteristics lived behind driving towards those results. And so I love being able to go into an executive team or meet with somebody and say, well, since you want to really grow market share, we're going to need this kinds of sets of behaviors from your people. So you start with the business strategy, and then you build the culture that will deliver you that kind of performance in your market space.
Yeah, and what I like on there is, I mean, yes, as you said correctly, this is one model, and you particularly like it, but there might be others. But it is that mindset of mapping these two that is actually quite well. And I think with this, I think I would like to let this model stand here, because otherwise we'll just delve too deep into the nitty-gritty of it. And I'll rather go to your second case study, because we said we'll just do a bit of a broad scan.
Sure. So I'll share screen again, if that's okay with you guys.
Yes.
And what we're going to move into now is as I said, a more recent.
Okay, your screen is up. Yes.
Thanks, Matthias. And so for the last 5 years, I think I started working with this organization, which I'm comfortable naming because I've got wonderful testimonials from the good folks over there at Festo Robotics. So Festo is a global company, but what's different here is that they've got a Canadian operation that's quite small in terms of their new partners that would be part of what we call NAFTA. And again, around the world, I'm not sure if everybody's heard of NAFTA, but the North American Free Trade Agreement is one way to look at how Canada, United States, and Mexico play together. And so with NAFTA, that's short form for North American Free Trade Agreement, the Festo folks wanted to shift from doing team-based selling that I've been working for the last 5 years around how to support a very collaborative approach to sales in industrial automation and robotics. That's what they sell. And so that team-based selling was working extremely well across Canada. But now that we've made this division that used to be known as Canada as a standalone, part of a bigger organization with shared accountabilities and interdependencies, they needed some new approaches. They needed some new technological systems put in place. So some IT transformation to to bring the Canadian operation into alignment and integration with both US and Mexico. And both of those markets made Canada seem pretty small. And so that meant some change. And so what this is an example of change management. Again, that's the work that I started to do with them about 5 years ago, just focusing on the Canadian market. And most recently, just prior to, I guess, the holiday season 2017. So kind of, I think it was late November, early December, we prepared for and delivered a national sales meeting where we were the learning part. So they had a lot of business content to get through around the restructure, some new technological processes that were being rolled out to support the sales organization. And we came in and dealt around change leadership, basically. And so that's what it was a series of change leadership workshops in preparation for the integration. So we are talking about management up to executive team across all the departments in the organization, wrapped around a national sales meeting, which is a 3-day event, and I've been part of it for the last 5 years. So that's context. Matthias, does that make sense?
Yeah, I say that's great. That's a good context. So yeah, let's dive into it then.
Okay. So then again, who are some of my change and transition gurus? And I'm going to make the distinction between John Cotter, that's pretty well recognized in the organizational development field as a consultant. John Cotter's got some change management tools and processes that I'll just share a little bit about. And it's great. It's around the moving the boxes on the org chart, or entering a new market space, or launching a new technology platform. That's change. It's an event that happens. Transition, in contrast, according to William Bridges, who's another guru that I learned a lot from and read all the books and used the slides in my workshops, William Bridges is talking about transitions as the internal psychological process of adapting to those changes that happen in organizations or our families. It's what we go through as people individually. And so when I started to get into some of that work in prep for Festo's leadership event, the national sales meeting, I kind of parked the Cotter stuff and said, we're going to not deal with change management, the classic kind of moving the boxes around and restructuring. I'm coming in around transitions. How do you as leaders deal with change, and how do you help your staff and members of your team deal with change, or even your customers for that matter? So that's really where the impetus of my contribution was with Festo and their national sales meeting. So the missing piece was really around that how we manage transitions, the human side of organizational transformation. And so what that looked like was, this is William Bridges' transition map. It suggests, and I believe it strongly from 25 plus years of doing this work, that we really, when there's a change, and I do not expect people to read that, that's kind of the secrets of that organization around what they were driving. But basically, there was a lot of global initiatives that were cascading right down to our friends in Canada around an international sales organization. And so there was a lot of change coming their way that were initiatives and programs and campaigns to roll out different ways of selling across NAFTA. And what that meant was not just what did the change mean for our sales organization, what's it mean for you? And so that's where this model, if you will, the transition map says, when we're going to go through a change, the very first thing we have to do is let go. We're losing something. We're losing the way we used to do it. And that's normal. And that, Matthias, you might go through that like crystal clear and lightning speed. And that's why this funny little map's got, a long tail. For some people, endings never end. Like they're still stuck in the old way. They can't let go. And other people, they can move quite quickly from letting go of the old way and into the neutral zone quite quickly. And as leaders, IT leaders perhaps, or HR leaders, or any leader, we got to help our people move from letting go into the neutral zone where things are fuzzy and a little confusing, and to the new beginnings as quickly as we can, with the least amount of carnage. And so IT supports people all through those three phases, I believe. I think that an IT leader helps people know what's going to end. Like, what won't we be doing anymore? What's going to stay the same, but what won't we be doing? So how we let go and say goodbye to those old systems. And again, in a digitization complex or construct, it might mean that the paper-based form filling out is not going to be happening. We're going to now log on and do it online, as an example. And then the IT leader wants to help move people into that kind of in-between times where there's a little bit more chaos, messy. It can be messy, but it can be a fresh start. It can be a completely new way of doing things. And then finally, the new normal or the new beginnings. What are the quick wins? How do we share that information? We've had some success. Maybe we've done a little bit of a pilot with just a small set of our clientele, our customer base, and they're on board. It seems to be working, and we learned a lot of things from that. And so that, as IT leaders, we want to really move people from ending to neutral zone to new beginnings as quickly as possible. And again, there's a lot of specific activities under each phase of the transition map that we would engage with, so that ultimately we're successful, that we implement those things that the sales organization is asking for, which they wouldn't get unless IT was propping them up, making it possible, giving them the data they need to be more successful in this case as a member of a larger market. So I would ask that question, as IT leaders with growth goals, where are you as you're bringing change to your organization, and how might you help move others along from endings, neutral zones to new beginning? And I think that's all I had to say about that.
Okay, great. Then we can unshare again, and let's just do a bit quick. There we go. Let's do a quick discussion about that. And you rattled a few cages for me, or put a few points in there that I would look into that. And the first one is, if you want to move somebody to that next level, where would you have to be? I would assume you have to be ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, I've done a lot of work where I might, there's a Ontario Power Authority in Canada, Ontario specifically. We've got a power authority, and the idea was very interesting to see that where we had a leadership team that were light years ahead of everyone else in the organization, because they had been thinking about some of these transitions for years. And as far as they were concerned, we've done it. We've restructured. We've changed the way that we measure power in Ontario. And it's like, what's your problem? You're in IT, or you're in accounting, or you got a client-facing role. Come on, I've got it figured out. Now you know about it, so let's move on. And so it was really interesting to see where in that one example was a huge gap between how on board the executives were and how in the dark everyone else were. And everyone else was with just going from letting go of the old way, embracing that there's going to be some messiness as we transition through the neutral zone, and they were nowhere near new beginnings. And so your sponsors usually are farther along, not necessarily, I'm good with this yet. Did I answer your question?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's on the one side, but then on the other side, the risk is, if you yourself don't believe in it and you're still in that letting go phase, you probably can't really move people from the back.
Yeah.
Forward.
Well, again, I watch myself when I say fake it till you make it. The idea that if I was a member of a leadership team and I, as the IT director, and I wasn't really sure about where we're going with this thing, whether it's selling food or power or whatever it is, I do know that I have an obligation that if the leadership team, my peers, if we've all agreed that we're going that direction, then when I leave the meeting, I better be speaking with that one voice. My heart might not be settled. I might not understand kind of how we're going to get there yet, but I believe that alignment with leadership teams is very mission critical for success for transforming organizations, that we need to hold those thoughts around, I'm not really sure about this, to that safe space called the leadership team, the boardroom, the management meetings, whatever we call it. But if we're going out and turning our back around, to the management team and saying to my people, this will never work, but we'll just go along with it. That's sabotage. So I think when we are in an organization, we've agreed as a member of a leadership team to help change things, we absolutely have to speak with belief and conviction that this is going to, in the long run, work. And the way where we work out the differences of opinion or the lack of clarity needs to, in my opinion, be at that leadership team level, not necessarily going down to the folks in our department and telling them what a crock this is going to be, but we're going to go along with it anyways. That's just, it's treasonous. I don't know.
No, but I think that's a very important point, because it tends to be this backstabbing, and if you're not ahead and you have to be, I think you raised a very important point there, that even if you're not totally sold yet, you might be in the neutral zone or so, you can still help the company along.
Absolutely.
Obviously, and I think that is where my other point comes in, is you said experiment and play with a small group. You've got that bell curve of people, your early adopters and your innovators that love to play with this new stuff, that are already there. And you would want to use those and not the laggards who, as somebody told me once, said they would still buy a dial phone if it was still available. So you don't want to play with them, because what they will tell you at the beginning is, the first time they run against a wall, they tell you, I told you so, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And there was, again, I think that there's the context around that you speak to your team or those that you lead with conviction, but there's also some reality. Again, I'm not telling people, or I would never advise, be fake, lie to them. If authentically as a leader, we can say, I'm nervous, we haven't got it all figured out. This is what we have got figured out. This is what we haven't quite figured out in this change, this transformation, likely involving some technological implementation that we've never tried before. This is what we don't know, but this is what we're doing top of house to try and figure that out. So again, in absence of clarity, letting an organization's participants know this is how we're going to approach getting the answers, but we don't have them all figured out yet. And so when we contain, again, the experimentation, we're doing a project, we've got a pilot, we're testing something, and that'll drive us to then get to the next stage where we may be able to implement something that's a little more defined, or we're going to stick with this one, go forward.
Great. I think that again gives it a nice cage around it, around what you had there. I think let's go to the third one.
Okay. In this case, what we're talking about here, yikes, where's my PowerPoint? There we go. So there we go. And the next slide. This is, again, a more recent. So what I'll be talking about here is the work I've been doing with my partner, Gay Marie. Gay Marie Brown's the Chief Marketing Officer and a co-founder of Equinix. In a previous life, we worked together when she was the national lead for Deloitte innovation team in Canada, but she also ran the global audit for Deloitte, well, globally. So she's a bit of a rock star in that whole innovation space. And so Gay Marie and I have been working with Pathways to Education, and their mandate, or to use our Singularity University language, Matthias, their massively transformational purpose is to increase graduation from high school in Canada by ending poverty. Now, raise your hand if you disagree with that. Like, how can you not support an organization that says they want to end poverty so that more kids get out of high school? I'm excited by that work. And they need some technology to help them with that. So this Pathways to Education, beautiful organization, great work, and they want to scale. They want to have greater impact in Canada and perhaps greater impact globally. And so Gay Marie and I started to work with them about a year ago. And we use a lot of design thinking principles. So how might we is a little kind of catchphrase. So the ambition matrix suggests how might we go beyond products to win, or to scale, in this case, to grow as an organization. So Pathways to Education was quite interested in looking at different types of innovation. And not all of it is on your value proposition around the product, service, something you sell. There's a lot of opportunities for innovation that is outside of the scope of just what you go to market with. And so that's where we were doing some of this work. And again, for data, what the top performers compared to Standard & Poor, S&P 500, year after year, the top performers are leveraging at least 5 or more innovations, and they're not all in that product or service category. So that's what I'm going to dive into here, Matthias.
Okay.
So this is again just a model. It's just a conceptual framework, but it's one that we're using a lot, Gamery and I, when we're working under Equinix or some of the other projects that we've got outside of that specific firm. We're using this framework to talk about that there are times where we're going to be implementing IT initiatives that would be optimizing existing products for existing customers. And that's core. Again, there's still some innovation opportunities there, but that's not really knocking it out of the park. Whereas the adjacent would recommend that we are working at doing some pretty significant changes, maybe in a new direction, maybe a new market facing. When we get into that transformational space, we're really talking about new products, services, assets that we go to market with or offer to our stakeholder community, and completely different ways of doing that. And so that is when, as I said, when we're trying to go beyond products or services to win, that is really where we are performing. So again, it was Pathways. They're in the educational service sector. They're not teachers. They're not principals. They don't all have PhDs. There's a lot of PhDs in the program. So what they're doing is they're developing initiatives that can really help them have a greater impact and grow as an organization. And so what we've been doing is challenging them to really look at maybe how their organization structured, some of the processes they use. Again, using this Doblin model of looking at different areas for innovation. And again, there are some ways that we can really make a huge difference. And what was found by the research by these folks is that only 2% of the organizations that really are nailing it around growth, it's around projects that they produce, products and processes. A lot more of that is around the cumulative value creation, around some of the other things around configuration and offering. Okay.
Great. Thanks very much. Let's dive a bit into that one then. And there I want to see, okay, so again, how could a IT leader start really driving this? How would they start with this?
Well, one of the things that I'm learning from organizations that are really looking to grow is it might involve beyond our organizational boundaries. So I could use words, and I'll park this one, Matthias, but I'll come back to the word co-opetition. How do we collaborate with our competitors? And so it's around creating ecosystems, and that's what we're doing with Pathways right now. Is we're really looking at how they leverage within the educational ecosystem other partners. We might be talking to Google. Like, what's Google got to do with education? Well, lots. It's more around a platform, a delivery mechanism. And so how do we digitize some of the programs that they've been doing with flesh and bone humans and really, well, just that, go beyond the human delivery mechanism that could be an augmented reality experience for a student. Yeah. So what I say that the conclusion I draw around what I've learned from my friends at Pathways to Education is how do you leverage an ecosystem in your market space? So that might be, I use the word collaborating with your competition or co-opetition, particularly in the private sector. I think that's really where there might be some wonderful opportunities to implement transformational change for organizations, particularly with IT. Where we might be sharing a need with other organizations that might be going after the same slice of the pie in the market as we are. But again, I did some work, Matthias, a little anecdote. sidebar here.
Mm-hmm.
The Canadian insurance industry has, several pretty aggressive players. I don't mean they're aggressive bad, but they're all trying to nibble up as much of the market as they can. And when I was doing some work around a big data analytics consultancy was supporting those clients in the insurance sector in Canada, and I was the facilitator to come in and run the innovation workshops, and I drove some design thinking processes for them for 5 years now it's been. And what their answer was, well, it's not that we just want to compete for a bigger slice of the same piece of pie. We want a bigger pie. And so they're collaborating, not as we're not talking price fixing or insider trading. We're talking about collaborating to create products and tools that service all the organizations across that sector so they can compete better, but differently, more informed, with more data. With technological solutions. So that's something I've learned is sometimes when we want to really transform for our organization, we might need to look outside our own organizational boundaries to find partners to do that work with. And I'm sure a lot of the IT leaders have already figured that out themselves, because you've only got so many resources yourself. Maybe your problem is similar to somebody else that you can join forces with. Did I answer your question, sir?
Yeah, you did, but I want to follow it up again and want to say, okay, that's on the one side we are looking at that. Then we're saying on the one side you've also got you named Pareto with the 80-20 rule, or you had it 92%, but anyway, it's normally it's that 20% of projects give you 80% of the results. Mm. How would the tools help you, and what tools would you use? I mean, you now said certain ones that you can identify these projects, and are the tools more about the experimentation and finding them, or is it empirically already finding them?
I'd say that again, you've probably heard this expression around fail fast, fail forward, or So I'm a big fan of experimenting, trying initiatives where we're not going to sink the ship. We're not putting all our hope on this one initiative. So I think if we can chunk out where we might have some longer term goals to implement some initiatives that would really change the game that we're in, or change the way that we play in the game, that we're not going to, again, be facing a new market or selling something different than we've ever sold before. But if we're just looking at that, I would say that again, chunking out incremental steps to move in a new direction is very important.
Yeah, I think that explains it to me, because it is not about there is no model that will tell you these are the 2% or these are the 20% that will give you 80%. You have to try it and then measure it and see, okay, in which direction does it go? Is that correctly how I understand it?
Yeah. Have you ever heard of there's a Canadian born, he's down in the States, he's Malcolm Gladwell. Have you ever heard of Malcolm Gladwell's work?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, great writer, very, very fun to listen to guy, smart man. And he's talked about innovation, and he's talked about the iterative nature. There's maybe you've heard this song called Hallelujah, written by a Canadian named Leonard Cohen. And Leonard wrote a pretty famous song called Hallelujah. And he was talking to another artist, recording artist. You've probably heard of this guy too, Bob Dylan. And Leonard and Bob were talking about kind of like insightful or innovative approaches to songwriting and world-class recordings of songs that changed their career, their history. And Leonard Cohen was asked by Bob, hey, how long did it take you to write that song there, Leonard, Hallelujah? And Leonard says, well, about 23 years. He rewrote it about 80 times. So it's an iterative. It's trying new approaches. So the first time he recorded it, I'm not saying it sucked, but it wasn't it as we know it now. And so then in back at you, Bob, says Leonard, and what about that one, the Blowing in the Wind that you wrote? How many times do you have to rewrite? I wrote it in 10 minutes. So I'll call that a eureka. We got it right the first time. You nailed it. Like you tried it once and it worked and it sticks. And that's it. It's called Blowing in the Wind. And Bob wrote it in 10 minutes and there you go. And so I think that knowing the difference between when we may have an opportunity for a eureka moment, like we nail it once, but generally that's really not how innovation works. It tends to be, control your variables. I don't want to get too deep into the scientific method, but, we like what variables will make an impact and what are we going to try in that direction with all other things staying the same. And what do we learn from that? Okay, now we've done that experiment. Now let's try and scale that or roll that out with another thing that we're going to manipulate and learn from. And I think that for IT leaders, that's got to be not the only way, but to try and kind of put all your eggs in one basket where we're writing line of code and we're testing and we're not going to market until we got it perfect. And then you find out your customers don't even want it. Whoops. Let's not wait for the hallelujah. I got it once right. And we're going to go to market with that. Let's test as we go.
I think you've got a very, very important point. I really like your example of the two, because you could naturally also say with the eureka moment, how much trying on other songs did it take to get to that one song? But let's not go into that discussion. Let's rather look at it from another point and say, how do we take these things further? How do we then identify that this is actually it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I think we need to then listen to our market. We need to ask, be those kids that aren't graduating from high school. So do you like to log in and use the app instead of meeting with a mentor for learning how to do math? So I think we need to, in that case, pathways to education, getting feedback from the end user. And that's always got to be, ultimately, it's the end user, right? When we're doing a methodology like design thinking, we start with the end user in mind. We create an understanding of their world. Then we start to ideate and think, well, what might be possible? How might we influence their world in a positive way differently? And then you come up with little experiments and you test it. You find out what you find out, and then you get feedback from the end user. So I think that's the answer, Matthias. How will we know? Well, we won't know unless we ask. And so we have to create, again, metrics that we can, objectively look at the answer. So did they like it more or did they like it less? And so it's always the end user in mind is where we start doing innovation and to kind of say, well, the chapter of this story that tells me ... I can't end that chapter until I've gone back to the end user to say, did that work? Give me some feedback. And again, there's a lot of ways that we can do that technologically without having, there's nothing wrong with face-to-face time in a focus group, but there are other ways also to get that kind of empirical evidence to support that worked. Let's do more of that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that is exactly where your data-based things come in. It's not about the experimentation, but it's about the evaluation of where does it work and so on. And you'll just have to find ways to measure it, be it by, as you say, customer satisfaction, be it by this one that really sells well, be it by whatever. I mean, the metrics you have to find.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Great. I think we are slowly but surely coming to the end of this, and we are already nearly at an hour. You know me, and you know that I always like to ask one question at the end in different guises. And at the moment, I'm asking my interviewees each that one question and say, if you're looking at everything you said this session, what is the one thing that you want the people to take away from it?
I think it's connecting the dots between the human side of change. So when we're talking about growth in organizations, usually something's got to be different. It would be insanity to think we'll just show up tomorrow and do exactly like we've ever done, and we're really going to nail it differently. That doesn't make sense. So we are implying growth, I believe, that there's some change. And I think that technologically we can create the best systems. I remember when, let me finish that thought and then I'll tell you I remember that no matter how good the technology is, it's people's behavior that has to use that technology. So that's when I first met you, Matthias, and Mark, your partner. And I was so enthralled by what you were talking about around digitization and technological transformation of organizations. And what caught my attention to want to talk to you guys was, and then there's people, right? So that's always going to be, I think that's the net for me, is that people use the tools. So we can create the best tools, but if we can't change the human behavior, it's going to be the same. Until we're living in a world, and I might be stealing this from Dr. Peter Diamandis, unless we're living in a fully, AI-run world, we're still humans. We still interact with each other, even if we're using some interface called something on the computer. So that would be the key takeaway for me, is that we cannot lose track of the fact that humans are emotional animals, and humans use really cool tools. So we can build the best tools in the world, but if that person doesn't feel right, doesn't embrace the why behind the tool, they're not going to use it. And I was going to tell you a story. When I started at CIBC Leadership Center, and I might have been under 30, I think I was around 28, 29 years old, and everybody else felt like they were at least 20 years older than me. So I kind of snuck in, it felt like, because I was the experiential learning guy and everybody else was knowledge management experts or psychometric gurus and really, really experienced folks. And we got access to, I can't even remember what the original group calendar and email. And it was when, do you remember Archie and Veronica's web browsers? And we're talking way back, way back in the, yeah.
I think we're both giving our age away,
yeah.
with me nodding. So
yeah, so that was early 90s stuff. And I remember working for these really impressive people with their resume. It was like, oh my gosh, how many PhDs do you have? And we came up with this, we had access to this very cool shared calendar and email discussion groups. And it's not what they were used to. And they didn't buy into it. So it was a cool tool, but they didn't embrace it. They didn't understand, well, why do we got to do that? Why don't we just get together and meet? Well, because some people are downtown Toronto and some are way over there at that conference facility called the Leadership Center. And so it doesn't matter how cool the tool is if people don't see the why and the how's this going to help me, the what's in it for me, the with them. You got to get the why and the what's this got to do with me, and now what's my role in that? So those are the three things I'd say around culture changes: the what's in it for me, the why are we even doing it, and how's this going to help me? What's my part to make it successful? And unless we get those three things for every single person in the organization crystal clear, it's hard. It's hard to embrace change.
Great, thanks. I think we can let that exactly stand like that as the last thought, because I think that was very nicely summarized, or nicely added on top actually of what we chatted today. So that is really great. I just want to remind everybody again that if you're an All Access Pass subscriber, you also get to download the slide decks in the end. You can look at these presentations again in your own time. And also there are other benefits. I mean, Tim has also said to me you'll be able to contact him. So that's great. So if you want to know a bit more and pick his brain a bit more, by all means, he said that's fine. So great. Thanks very much. Thanks for that, Tim. And then, the last thing is actually only to thank Tim for sharing this experience of yours. And yes, you've given your age away, but we can see that there is lots of experience, and I love that. So thanks very much there. And with that, I think that's it. That concludes our session. And a very good morning, a very good day, and a very good night to all of you, wherever you are around the globe. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Matthias. Bye, folks.